I am sitting here in the living room of my Aspen home, the warmth of the stone fireplace at my back sinking into the soft leather of my sofa. As I look out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the snow falling gently over the mountains, I cannot help but think back to the dinner that forever changed my life. My name is Nia. I am 35 years old and a single mother to amazing twins. When my husband passed away in a tragic accident years ago, my own parents shut their door in my face, leaving my working-class in-laws to take us in. My family had always treated me like the dark-skinned failure of the house, a joke who shoveled horse manure for a living. But they had absolutely no idea that the therapeutic ranch I built from the ground up had just been acquired for $500 million. When they demanded I hand over my life savings to bail out my golden child sister and her arrogant husband, I dropped a truth bomb that shattered their entire reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Sign this $50,000 check right now, Nia. The command cut through the clinking of crystal glasses and the soft jazz playing in the background. My mother Vivian sat at the opposite end of the massive mahogany dining table, her posture rigid and her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. We were gathered for our traditional Sunday dinner after church, a weekly ritual that usually involved an extravagant spread of food and an equally extravagant display of passive-aggressive behavior. The dining room of my parents' sprawling estate was practically suffocating with its heavy velvet drapes and oversized chandeliers. The table was loaded with baked macaroni and cheese collard greens, cooked with smoked turkey, and a perfectly roasted leg of lamb that my mother claimed to have prepared herself, even though we all knew she had hired a private chef for the afternoon. Trevor is running into a little bit of a cash flow problem with his new business venture, my mother continued, not even bothering to look up from her plate as she meticulously sliced her meat. Bradley needs working capital immediately. You are the younger sister, Nia. You need to learn how to sacrifice for the family. She pushed a blank check across the polished wood of the table, tapping her manicured fingernail against the paper. I sat perfectly still, feeling the familiar heavy weight of the room pressing down on my shoulders. Across from me sat my older sister, Chantel. She was the undisputed golden child of the Sinclair family, a successful plastic surgeon who had always been praised for her light skin and her bone-straight hair. I, on the other hand, had inherited the rich, dark complexion of our ancestors and wore my natural coils with pride, a physical difference that my mother had used to subtly tear me down since we were little girls. Chantel did not even try to hide her amusement. She casually smoothed a stray strand of her perfectly flat-ironed hair and let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Come on, Nia, do not be selfish." Chantel said, her voice dripping with that sickeningly sweet tone she reserved specifically for insulting me. "It is not like you actually need the money. You are a widow living out in the country, playing in the mud with horses all day. What could you possibly need $50,000 for? You do not have a social life to maintain, or a reputation to uphold. I need to expand my luxury spa clinic, and Bradley needs to secure his financial portfolio. Just sign the check and go back to your little barn." I looked at my sister, marveling at how easily the cruelty flowed from her lips. She had always believed that her medical degree and her lighter complexion made her inherently superior. My parents had nurtured that belief constantly, comparing us, constantly reminding me that I was the difficult child, the plain daughter who lacked the grace and sophistication of her older sister. They saw my therapeutic equestrian center not as a business, but as a dirty, embarrassing hobby that I used to hide from the real world. Before I could formulate a response, Chantel's husband Bradley leaned across the table. Bradley was a white finance broker who wore his privilege like a heavy cologne. He had always looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain, fully buying into the narrative my family had created about my supposed incompetence. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a greasy, crumpled property transfer document. Without a word of warning, Bradley tossed the heavy stack of papers directly onto my plate. The documents landed right on top of my food, splashing cheese sauce onto the crisp white tablecloth and entirely ruining my dinner. I stared at the ruined food, feeling a slow, steady pulse of anger beginning to throb behind my eyes. "Just sign the guarantee," Nia Bradley said, loosening his expensive silk tie with an arrogant smirk. "Chantel needs the space for her new clinic. We are putting down your name as a secondary guarantor so we can secure the commercial lease. It is just a formality. You really do not have a choice anyway. You should be grateful we are even allowing you to be part of a high-level business transaction. It is the closest you will ever get to real corporate success." I slowly picked up my napkin and wiped a stray drop of sauce from my wrist. I did not yell. I did not cry. Years of enduring their emotional abuse had taught me how to lock my feelings away behind a wall of absolute calm. I pushed the ruined plate and the greasy documents away from me. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice steady and quiet, cutting through the dining room like a cold winter breeze. "I am not giving you $50,000, and I am certainly not co-signing a commercial lease for a business I have absolutely nothing to do with." The silence that followed was deafening. Chantel dropped her fork. Bradley's smirk vanished, replaced by an ugly scowl of indignation. My mother slammed her hands down on the table so hard that the crystal wine glasses trembled. "How dare you speak to us with such disrespect?" my mother shouted, her carefully crafted, elegant persona instantly shattering. "We took you back into our lives when you had nothing. We tolerate your presence at this table. Your brother-in-law is offering you a chance to be useful to this family for once in your life, and you sit there acting like you are above us. You owe us, Nia. You owe this family your absolute obedience." At the head of the table, my father, Marcus Sr., finally broke his silence. He was a large, imposing man who ran his business and his family with an iron fist. He stood up slowly, casting a long, intimidating shadow across the dining room. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face, his eyes blazing with furious authority. "You listen to me, and you listen to me very carefully," my father boomed, his voice vibrating off the walls. "This family put a roof over your head when you were growing up. We clothed you. We fed you. When your husband died and left you with 2 screaming infants, we were the ones who had to deal with the shame of your financial ruin. You are the darkest, most stubborn, most ungrateful child in this house. You have never been worthy of the Sinclair name. Now you will pick up that pen, you will sign that check for your sister, and you will guarantee that lease. Chantel is a prominent doctor. She is the future and the pride of this family. You are nothing but a hired hand. You will do as you are told to protect your sister's future." The venom in his words was meant to crush me, to reduce me to the frightened, insecure girl I used to be. They wanted me to break down, to apologize, to desperately seek their approval by handing over the little money they thought I had managed to scrape together. They honestly believed they held all the power in the room. They thought my refusal was just a temporary act of rebellion that they could easily crush with enough shouting and intimidation. But as I sat there looking at the furious faces of the people who shared my blood, I did not feel fear. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I looked at the crumpled lease agreement Bradley had thrown on my plate. I looked at the blank check my mother was trying to force me to sign. And then I let out a low, genuinely amused laugh. "You all really think I am just being selfish?" I said, slowly rising from my chair to stand at my full height. I picked up the dirty lease agreement with 2 fingers and tossed it back at Bradley, watching it hit his pristine suit jacket. "You think I am holding out on you because I am spiteful. You sit here calling me a failure, demanding $50,000, like it is my entire life savings, acting like you are the masters of the corporate universe." I leaned forward, planting both hands firmly on the edge of the dining table, making direct eye contact with my father, then my mother, and finally my sister. "Tell me something," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous silken whisper. "Do any of you actually read the financial news, or do you just use the papers to line your expensive trash cans? Because if you had bothered to open the Wall Street Journal this morning, you would know that you are asking the wrong person for a $50,000 handout." The silence in the dining room shattered the moment the words left my mouth. My mother Vivian slammed her hands onto the table, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling with absolute rage. She leaned forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. You ungrateful, wretched little thing, she hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic energy that seemed to suck the warmth right out of the room. We give you a seat at this table, we invite you into our beautiful home, and you dare to sit there and insult us. You have always been a bitter, jealous girl, Nia. You resent your sister because she is everything you could never be. I did not cry. I did not shrink back into my chair the way I would have a decade ago. Instead, I picked up my heavy crystal water goblet. I held it for a brief second, feeling its weight, and then I casually dropped it onto the hardwood floor. The explosive crash of shattering glass echoed through the sprawling room, instantly silencing my mother. Chantel jumped in her seat, clutching her chest, while Bradley flinched, his arrogant smirk momentarily vanishing. I pointed a single finger straight at my mother's face. "You want to talk about gratitude?" I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "Let us talk about exactly what I have to be grateful for. Let us go back exactly 8 years. It was a Tuesday. It was freezing and the rain was coming down in sheets. Jamal had just been killed in that horrific car accident. The landlord had changed the locks on our apartment because I was 3 days late on rent while trying to pay for a funeral. I stood on your immaculate front porch, soaking wet, holding Malik and Maya in my arms. They were 6 months old. Their little lips were turning blue from the cold. I begged you to let us in just for one night, just so your grandchildren would not freeze to death on the streets." My mother stiffened her eyes, darting away from my piercing gaze for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered her haughty posture. She crossed her arms, her chin lifting in defiance. "You are leaving out the context, Nia," she snapped back without a single ounce of remorse. Chantel was hosting the regional hospital directors that night. It was the most important networking event of her career. She was securing the funding for her private clinic. I could not have you standing in our grand foyer dripping mud and poverty all over the imported rugs holding 2 screaming infants. What would those wealthy investors have thought of our family? You looked like a common street beggar." Chantel sighed loudly, inspecting her perfectly polished nails as if this conversation was boring her. "Honestly, Nia, you have to admit your timing was incredibly selfish. I had catered salmon and a string quartet. You wailing on the front porch completely ruined the aesthetic of the evening. I actually lost a major donor because they were so disturbed by the commotion outside. You have always been so dramatic." I stared at my sister, marveling at the absolute void where her soul should have been. But my mother was not finished. She leaned across the table again, her voice dropping into a cruel, venomous tone that targeted the deepest insecurities she had planted in me since childhood. "You brought that misery upon yourself, Nia," my mother declared. "I told you not to marry that mechanic. I told you Jamal was a broke nobody who would leave you with nothing. But you were always so stubborn. You knew you did not have Chantel's light skin, her delicate features, or her natural grace. You always stuck out in this family with your dark complexion and your rough edges. You should have been grateful a man like that even looked at you, but instead you dragged his dead weight and those crying babies to my doorstep, expecting me to sacrifice your sister's brilliant future for your massive failures. The colorism, the blatant hatred for my dark skin, the absolute disregard for my dead husband." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Years ago, a speech like that would have broken me into a million pieces. I would have run out of the room crying, believing every single hateful word. But the woman sitting in that dining chair today had been forged in fires they could not even comprehend. I held my mother's gaze, my face an impenetrable mask of stone. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I just let the silence stretch out, letting the profound ugliness of her soul echo in the quiet room. That is when Bradley decided to intervene. He wiped his mouth with his linen napkin, adjusting his expensive silk tie, clearly eager to reassert his dominance as the wealthy white savior of the family. He pointed his fork at me, adopting the condescending tone he always used when addressing me. "Listen here," Nia, Bradley commanded. "The past is the past. We cannot change what happened years ago, and frankly, bringing it up now is just manipulative. We are being generous right now. We are letting you sit at our dining table. You are eating the food I paid for. You are sitting under the roof that I maintain. You are taking up space in our house. So you are going to drop this ridiculous victim act, pick up a pen, and sign that check to help your sister. It is the least you can do to pay us back for the meals you are consuming today. I slowly stood up from my chair. I smoothed down the front of my tailored dress. I looked at the extravagant chandelier hanging above us, then at the expensive artwork lining the walls, and finally my eyes locked dead onto Bradley. I tilted my head slightly, a razor-sharp smile playing at the corners of my lips. "Are you absolutely sure this is your house, Bradley?" Bradley blinked, the color draining from his face as his arrogant smirk collapsed into genuine confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at my mother, who was staring at me with her jaw tightly clenched, a vein throbbing in her neck. The camera angle shifts to an over-the-shoulder perspective right behind me, framing my parents and my sister as I look down at them. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. They were no longer the intimidating figures of my childhood. They were just small, greedy people sitting at a very large table. I turned my body, slowly shifting my gaze away from my blood relatives and looking down toward the far end of the long mahogany table. Sitting there looking entirely out of place among the crystal goblets and fine china were Arthur and Mary Davis, my late husband's parents. They had been sitting in stoic silence for the entire afternoon. They had endured the subtle sneers, the rolled eyes, and the blatant disrespect from my family. My mother had purposefully seated them near the swinging kitchen doors, separating them from the main conversation, treating them more like the hired help than guests of honor. Arthur wore his best suit, a slightly faded navy jacket he had owned for 15 years, while Mary wore a simple, carefully pressed floral dress. They did not have Chantel's designer labels or Bradley's custom tailoring, but they possessed a quiet, unshakable dignity that my family could never buy. Earlier that afternoon, Bradley had actually asked Arthur to pass the butter by whistling at him as if calling a dog. Arthur had simply smiled past the dish and continued eating his meal with the grace of a man who knew his own worth. Now sitting quietly as my family unleashed their venom, the Davises remained perfectly composed. I walked slowly down the length of the table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I stopped behind Mary and rested my hands gently on her shoulders. She reached up and covered my hand with hers, her skin warm and rough from years of hard work. The contrast between my mother's icy glare and Mary's warm, supportive touch was the story of my entire adult life. "You want to talk about family?" I said, my voice projecting clearly across the vast dining room. "You want to talk about loyalty and sacrifice? Let us talk about what real family looks like. Let us talk about the people who actually showed up when the world fell apart. 8 years ago, when my own mother slammed the door in my face to protect her precious aesthetic and her VIP guests, I sat on your front steps with my babies shivering in my arms. I had nowhere else to go. I took out my cracked cell phone, and I called the parents of the man you all called a broke nobody." My father crossed his arms, letting out a loud scoff that echoed in the silent room. "Oh, here we go with the tragic backstory. We are trying to conduct a business transaction, Nia. We do not need a history lesson about your in-laws. We all know they are decent people, but decency does not pay the bills." You are going to listen to every single word I fired back, my voice cracking like a whip. "Because you need to understand exactly why I owe you absolutely nothing." Arthur and Mary did not care about VIP guests. They did not care if my muddy shoes ruined their carpets. Arthur got out of bed at 2 in the morning, grabbed the keys to his rusting 1998 Ford pickup truck, and drove 50 miles through a blinding rainstorm to rescue us. They brought us into their small 2-bedroom home without a second of hesitation. They gave up their own bed so Malik and Maya could sleep comfortably while they slept on a broken pull-out couch in the living room. My mother rolled her eyes dramatically, picking up her wineglass and taking a long sip. How touching. A regular charity case. I am sure they enjoyed playing savior to the poor helpless widow. It must have given them such a sense of purpose. They did not play savior. Vivian, I said, deliberately using her first name to strip away any remaining maternal respect. They sacrificed everything. They did not just give me a place to sleep. When they realized I had absolutely no money, no credit, and no way to provide a future for their grandchildren, they did not hand me a loan document and demand I sign my life away to bail out their own bad investments. I moved to stand directly behind Arthur, placing my hand on his broad shoulder. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with quiet pride. Arthur is a retired combat veteran. I continued, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the room. Mary spent 30 years working in a public school cafeteria serving food to children who had less than we did. They had a modest pension and a small house that they had spent their entire lives paying off. They had earned their retirement. They had earned the right to rest. Do you know what they did with their life savings? The room was dead silent. Even Chantel had stopped inspecting her nails, her eyes narrowing as she listened. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly unable to meet Arthur's steady gaze. They took every single penny of their retirement, I said, my voice thick with emotion but completely steady. They went to the bank, they mortgaged their home, and they bought me a barren, dusty 50-acre plot of land just outside the city limits. They handed me the deed and told me to build the therapeutic horse ranch Jamal and I had always dreamed of. They risked their own survival, their own future, to give me a second chance at life. They did not ask for a percentage of the business. They did not ask me to co-sign a predatory commercial lease. They spent their weekends helping me mend fences and paint barns. They gave from a place of pure, unconditional love, something this family knows absolutely nothing about. Chantel let out a sharp, mocking laugh that shattered the heavy tension in the room. She tossed her linen napkin onto her plate and leaned back in her chair, shaking her head in sheer disbelief. She looked at me as if I had just told the most ridiculous joke she had ever heard. "Oh, please, Nia," Chantel sneered, her voice echoing with utter contempt. "Are we supposed to be impressed by this little sob story? They bought you a patch of dirt. Congratulations! How many pennies does that stinking horse farm actually make? You spend your days shoveling manure and offering pony rides to troubled kids. It is a charity project, not a real business. We are talking about $50,000 of real money here. We are talking about expanding a premier luxury medical clinic that caters to the elite of this city. Stop wasting our time with this emotional garbage and sign the check. You owe this family for the embarrassment you have caused us all these years." I stared at Chantel, watching the absolute arrogance radiating from her perfectly contoured face. She was so blinded by her own ego, so convinced of her own superiority, that she could not even comprehend what was about to happen. I reached into my leather tote bag resting on the floor nearby. I pulled out a thick, heavy legal folder bound with a thick red ribbon. I walked slowly back to the head of the table, standing right between Chantel and Bradley. I lifted the folder high into the air, making sure every single person at the table was watching my every move. With a swift, violent motion, I slammed the heavy folder directly onto the table right in front of Chantel's face. The loud smack made both her and Bradley jump in their seats, their eyes widening in shock. I leaned down, placing both hands on the table and bringing my face just inches from my sister's shocked expression. I watched her perfectly manicured hand hover over the red ribbon, a sudden flicker of doubt crossing her eyes. She looked at Bradley, who gave a dismissive scoff, but I could see the sweat forming on his brow. The sheer weight of the folder, the official seals stamped on the outside, and the absolute certainty in my voice were finally beginning to crack their impenetrable arrogance. "Go ahead," I whispered, gesturing toward the documents. "Open it. Read every single page. You should read the name of the corporation that currently owns that barren patch of dirt." The heavy leather-bound dossier hit the mahogany table with a deafening thud that made the crystal wine glasses rattle. Chantel jumped back in her antique dining chair, as if the thick stack of papers was completely engulfed in flames. The smug, condescending smile that had been plastered across her face just moments ago completely vanished into thin air. Bradley stared at the folder, his eyes darting between the embossed gold seal on the cover and my completely unbothered, stone-cold expression. I did not break eye contact with my sister as I spoke. I instructed Chantel to open the folder. I told her to look at the very first page and read the exact name of the corporation that actually owned the barren patch of dirt she had just spent the last 10 minutes mocking. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled slightly as she flipped open the cover. Her eyes scanned the top document, and I watched the precise second her brain completely failed to comprehend what she was looking at. For 5 entire years, my family genuinely believed I was just shoveling manure and struggling to survive out in the country. They thought my therapeutic writing center for children with autism was just a desperate, pathetic charity project designed to distract me from my grief. They never bothered to visit me. They never bothered to ask a single question about my daily life. If they had bothered to care, they would have known that I was not just putting neurodivergent kids on horses. I had partnered with an elite team of neuroscientists and biomedical engineers from a nearby research university. Together, we had developed a revolutionary piece of biotechnology. We created biometric sensors seamlessly integrated into the structural core of equestrian saddles. These highly advanced sensors tracked neurological feedback, muscle micromovements, and sensory processing data in real time while the children rode the horses. The rhythmic, repetitive motion of the animal, combined with our proprietary biofeedback software, actively mapped and accelerated neuropathway development in autistic patients. We had secured 3 international patents. We had published peer-reviewed studies in top medical journals. We had completely disrupted the entire pediatric neurological therapy industry without my family knowing a single thing about it. Chantel's voice barely worked. She choked on her own breath as she read the numbers printed in bold black ink across the executive summary. $500 million. She whispered the number as if saying the words out loud would somehow burn her tongue. Bradley snatched the papers right out of her hands, his eyes widening to the size of saucers. He frantically flipped through the pages of the acquisition agreement. It was a finalized, legally binding contract with Apex Medical Corporation, the absolute largest healthcare conglomerate in the United States. They had not just bought my patents, they had purchased my entire therapeutic ecosystem. They bought the software, the hardware technology, the proprietary data, and the rural property itself for $500 million in pure cash and stock options. The silence in the dining room was absolute. You could hear the heavy rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. My father, the intimidating man who had just demanded I sign away my non-existent savings to protect his golden child, sank slowly back into his chair. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. But the most sickening reaction of all came from my mother, Vivian. My mother looked at the acquisition documents, then slowly looked up at me. I could practically watch the gears turning in her head, calculating the sheer unimaginable magnitude of $500 million. The vicious, hateful woman who had just called me a dark-skinned failure suddenly evaporated into thin air. In her place stood a beaming, tearful, proud matriarch. Vivian practically leaped out of her dining chair. She knocked over her own wineglass in her haste, sending a pool of dark red liquid soaking into the pristine white tablecloth. But she did not even care. She rushed around the huge table, her arms outstretched, a giant fake smile plastered across her face. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant girl," my mother cried out, her voice dripping with a sudden suffocating affection that made my stomach churn. "I knew it. I always knew you had absolute greatness inside of you, Nia. You are the ultimate pride of our family. You are the very definition of Black excellence. This is exactly why I pushed you so hard all these years. I knew you needed that tough love to build character. I knew you needed me to challenge you so you could rise to your true potential and prove everyone wrong. Come here and give your mother a hug. We have to celebrate this incredible victory. We have to call the country club immediately and organize a massive gala in your honor." I took a sharp, deliberate step back, refusing to let her touch me. She stood there with her arms suspended in the air, looking incredibly foolish and desperate. The hypocrisy was so thick, I could practically choke on it. Less than 10 minutes ago, I was a common street beggar, dragging my dead husband's memory through the mud. Now suddenly, I was the brilliant daughter she had always believed in. It was an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation, a seamless, terrifying pivot from abuse to adoration, all triggered by the simple sight of 9 zeros on a piece of paper. I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust for the woman who gave birth to me. While my mother was desperately trying to rewrite a lifetime of emotional abuse, Bradley had somehow managed to regain his sleazy corporate composure. He tossed the acquisition papers back onto the table and let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded completely hollow and forced. He walked over to his leather briefcase, which was resting on the side buffet table, and snapped the heavy brass locks open. "Well, this is just fantastic news for all of us," Bradley declared, pulling out a single sheet of paper stamped with a state notary seal. "This is exactly what family is for Nia. Building generational wealth together. You really pulled off an incredible feat. But let us not forget who actually helped you lay the foundation for this empire." He walked back to the dining table and slid the single piece of paper right next to my $500 million contract. It was a corporate registration form from exactly 5 years ago. "You see, Nia, our family currently owns a 30% stake in your little biotech venture." Bradley smiled, his eyes gleaming with greedy malice. "Do you not remember? When you first bought that dusty ranch, you needed help filing your initial limited liability paperwork. You were just a grieving widow who did not understand complex business law. I handled all the state registrations for you. I was the one who submitted your tax identification numbers. And as your financial proxy, I made sure to structure the holding company to protect the Sinclair family interests. You owe us $150 million, Nia, and I have the legal binding documentation right here to prove it." Bradley stood tall, puffing out his chest as he smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit. He looked around the dining room, soaking in the sudden, desperate admiration radiating from my mother and sister. Vivian let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief, pressing her hand to her heart, as if Bradley had just descended from the heavens to rescue them from poverty. Chantel's posture completely transformed. The sheer panic that had gripped her just moments ago evaporated instantly, replaced by that familiar, sickeningly smug smile. She crossed her legs and took a slow, victorious sip of her wine, looking at me as if I were a mouse that had just been caught in a trap. "You see, Nia? This is why you should always leave the real business to the professionals," Bradley said, his voice dripping with condescension. He began pacing slowly behind his dining chair, adopting the arrogant cadence of a man delivering a lecture to a slow child. "You honestly thought a grieving, uneducated single mother was going to navigate the complexities of corporate law all by herself. Do you have any idea what it takes to get biomedical patents approved? The zoning boards, the medical compliance regulations, the endless federal red tape. You were a massive liability. I stepped in and opened those doors for you. I am a licensed financial broker with a sterling reputation in this city. My signature, my professional connections, and frankly, my skin color made those permits happen. I protected this family's assets when you were too busy crying over your dead husband to understand how the real world works." He stopped pacing and leaned heavily over the table, pressing his knuckles into the polished wood. He stared down at me, attempting to use his physical presence and his societal privilege to shrink me back into submission. "That 30% stake is my commission for playing your savior," Bradley stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You are going to sign a legally binding release form today, and you are going to wire $150 million directly into my offshore holding account by tomorrow morning. If you try to fight me on this, I will tie you up in corporate litigation for the next decade. I will freeze your assets. I will drag your little therapeutic ranch through so many injunctions that your new buyers will walk away from the deal just to avoid the headache. You do not have the capital or the pedigree to fight me in court, Nia. Do the smart thing and pay your family what we are owed." I stood perfectly still, letting his threats hang in the stifling air of the dining room. I looked at my mother, who was nodding vigorously in agreement with a man who was actively threatening to extort her own flesh and blood. I looked at Chantel, who was already mentally spending money that did not belong to her. And then I looked back at Bradley. The sheer audacity of his entitlement was almost breathtaking. He truly believed that his mere presence in my life entitled him to a massive portion of my life's work. He thought his gender and his race gave him a permanent upper hand and absolute authority that I would be too intimidated to ever challenge. "You always did mistake my silence for stupidity, Bradley," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through his arrogant bluster. I slowly reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out my smartphone. I did not break eye contact with him as my thumb swiped across the screen, pulling up a specific audio file I had saved and backed up in 3 different secure locations. I placed the phone flat on the mahogany table and tapped the play button. The audio was crystal clear. It started with the distinct sound of ice clinking in a crystal glass, followed immediately by Chantel's anxious voice. "Are you absolutely sure this is going to work, Bradley? If the federal auditors trace those new credit cards back to our home address, I could lose my medical license. We cannot afford that kind of exposure right now." Bradley's recorded voice echoed through the dining room, filled with a chilling, callous arrogance. "Relax, babe. I have handled this a dozen times. Nia's credit is already an absolute joke. She is completely drowning in Jamal's unpaid hospital bills and those ridiculous funeral expenses. The collection agencies are calling her day and night. We just use her social security number to open the new accounts, funnel the overflow capital from your clinic into the offshore trusts, and register everything under her maiden name. If the IRS decides to audit anyone, they are going to audit the broke, desperate widow living in a barn. They will take one look at her financial ruin and assume she was trying to scam the system to feed her kids. She is too busy changing diapers and crying to ever check her credit reports. She will never even know we did it." I tapped the screen, pausing the recording. The silence that slammed into the dining room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The transformation in Bradley's face was spectacular. All the color drained from his cheeks in an instant, leaving him looking like a sick, pale ghost. The confident, threatening corporate broker had vanished completely. His mouth hung open, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door, as if calculating his chances of making a run for it. Chantel looked like she had just been physically struck. She dropped her wineglass, the crystal shattering against her plate, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling out of her chair. "Identity theft," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. "Wire fraud, interstate tax evasion, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Those are federal offenses, Bradley. You used my social security number to open 5 fraudulent high-limit credit lines to fund the grand opening of Chantel's first luxury clinic. You thought I was too broken, too consumed by my grief to notice my mail being strategically redirected. But I noticed. I noticed every single discrepancy. I kept every single bank statement. I hired a forensic accountant 3 years ago to trace every single wire transfer back to the exact IP address of your home office." Bradley began to stammer, his chest heaving as panic finally set in. "You cannot use that. That recording is completely illegal. You recorded us without our consent. It is totally inadmissible in a court of law. My lawyers will have it thrown out before you even step foot in front of a judge. You have nothing but an illegal audio file." I let out a soft, genuinely amused laugh. I picked up my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, looking at him with a mixture of pity and absolute triumph. "Do you honestly think I brought this recording here today to use in a courtroom, Bradley?" I asked, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "I did not bring this here for a judge. I brought it for leverage. You stood there 5 minutes ago bragging about how you slipped your name into my initial corporate filings. You thought you were so incredibly clever, manipulating a grieving widow, structuring a holding company to secure 30% of my life's work." I leaned over the table, mirroring the exact intimidating posture he had used against me moments earlier. But unlike him, I actually held all the power. "But did you honestly think I was stupid enough to let a snake like you hold the keys to my empire? Did you really believe I would just blindly sign documents without having my own legal counsel review every single syllable? The second I discovered your little credit card fraud scheme 5 years ago, I realized exactly what kind of predator you were. So I let you file those initial papers. I let you think you had successfully stolen 30% of my company. I smiled, nodded, and played the grateful, ignorant sister-in-law exactly like you wanted me to. Bradley swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat rolling down the side of his face. His hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of his briefcase. But 3 years ago, I legally transferred every single patent, every piece of proprietary software, every medical trial result, and every square inch of that ranch into an ironclad, irrevocable blind trust, I explained, watching the absolute horror dawn in his eyes. The limited liability company that you supposedly own 30% of is nothing but a hollow, empty shell. It holds absolutely zero assets. It has zero value. The $500 million acquisition deal I just signed with Apex Medical Corporation was negotiated entirely through that new independent trust. Your 30% stake is worth exactly $0.00. I stood up straight, smoothing my dress one final time, delivering the ultimate crushing blow. And the most beautiful part of this entire arrangement, I said, a cold, victorious smile spreading across my face, is that the primary beneficiary of that $500 million trust is not even me. The blood drained from Bradley's face so fast I thought he might actually pass out right there in his custom-tailored suit. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his dining chair, collapsing into it as if all the bones in his legs had suddenly dissolved. A slow, heavy silence descended upon the room, thicker and more suffocating than the humid summer air outside. I watched the absolute devastation wash over my family. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing to witness. Chantel sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, as her brain short-circuited, entirely unable to process the magnitude of her defeat. All of her designer clothes, her elite social circles, and her luxury clinic meant absolutely nothing in the shadow of $500 million. She was instantly, irrevocably dwarfed by the very sister she had spent a lifetime treating like the dirt beneath her expensive heels. "An irrevocable trust, Bradley," I said, projecting my voice so it carried clear and sharp to every corner of the extravagant dining room. As a licensed financial broker, you know exactly what those words mean. It means the trust cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the beneficiary. The grantor, meaning me, has surrendered all ownership of the assets. The intellectual property, the patents, the land, the software, and the massive cash payout from Apex Medical Corporation are entirely locked away. They are completely shielded from your pathetic, fraudulent little holding company and completely shielded from anyone sharing Sinclair blood. I kept enough to ensure that Malik and Maya will never want for anything. I continued pacing slowly behind my chair, holding the room captive. I kept enough to pay off the medical debt Jamal accrued before he died, the debt you so generously exploited. But the rest of it, the overwhelming, unimaginable bulk of that wealth, it belongs entirely to the trust. Vivian's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The maternal facade she had tried to construct just moments ago completely disintegrated, revealing the ugly, ravenous greed festering underneath. She slammed both of her hands flat against the mahogany table, rattling the crystal glasses and silver cutlery. "You are lying!" My mother shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically between me and the legal documents resting on the table. "You cannot do this. You are a Sinclair. I gave birth to you. I raised you under this roof. You cannot take $500 million and just lock it away from your own flesh and blood. You will march into whatever attorney's office drew up those ridiculous papers, and you will add my name to that trust immediately. You will add your sister's name. You owe this family your loyalty. We are your blood." I stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. "Blood." I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Do not dare speak to me about blood. Where was your precious family loyalty when I was begging you for a place to sleep? Where was your blood tie when I was rationing baby formula and selling my own clothes just to keep the heat on during winter? You did not look at me and see blood back then, Vivian. You looked at me and saw mud on your imported rugs. You looked at me and saw an aesthetic inconvenience. You were perfectly willing to let your own flesh and blood freeze on the street to impress a few wealthy donors. But now, suddenly, because there are 9 zeros attached to my name, you want to play the role of the devoted mother. It makes me absolutely sick. Chantel finally found her voice, though it trembled with a mixture of raw envy and rage. You are doing this out of pure spite, Nia. You are actually throwing away generational wealth just to punish us because you have always been bitter. You are destroying the Sinclair legacy. I am not destroying anything, Chantel. I fired back, my eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unapologetic intensity. I am protecting my life's work from parasites. You and your husband built your so-called empire on the back of my ruined credit. You committed federal identity theft. You committed wire fraud. You stole from a grieving widow. Do you honestly think I would ever let you get your greedy hands on the technology that my husband and I dreamed of creating together? You are lucky I am not handing this recording over to the federal authorities right this second and watching you both go to prison. Bradley flinched violently at the word prison, shrinking further down into his chair. He was ruined. He knew it, and I knew it. The power he thought he held over me was nothing but a cheap illusion, completely shattered by my forensic accountant and a single airtight legal strategy. Vivian was not finished. She rounded the edge of the table, marching toward me with her finger pointed sharply at my chest. Her face was flushed, her breath coming in ragged, furious gasps. I do not care what kind of petty revenge you think you are exacting right now, my mother snarled, trying one last desperate attempt to assert her parental authority. I am your mother, and I am demanding that you fix this. You will dissolve that trust. I do not care who you named as the beneficiary. You will tear up those papers, and you will bring that money back into this family where it belongs. Do you hear me? You cannot give away what belongs to us. Who did you even name? Who could possibly deserve that money more than the family that raised you? Right on cue, as if the universe itself was orchestrating the perfect symphony of poetic justice. The heavy double oak doors of the dining room swung open. The sudden noise made everyone in the room jump. Standing in the doorway was an older, distinguished gentleman wearing a sharp charcoal gray suit. He carried a slim leather briefcase and possessed an air of quiet, absolute authority. It was Marcus Sterling, the senior partner at the most ruthless corporate law firm in the state, and my personal attorney. He surveyed the chaotic scene in the dining room with a mild, unbothered expression, completely ignoring the furious glaring from my mother and the panicked sweating from Bradley. He walked straight toward me, his polished shoes silent against the hardwood floor. I apologize for the untimely interruption. Nia Marcus said, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the toxic atmosphere of the room like a sharp knife. But you instructed me to bring these directly to you the absolute second the ink was dry. The final clearances from the state registry and the federal banking authorities just came through. He set his briefcase down on a side table, clicked the latches open, and withdrew a thick stack of documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He turned to face the room, his eyes scanning the faces of my furious family, before settling on the far end of the table. My parents-in-law, Arthur and Mary Davis, had remained perfectly silent throughout the entire explosive ordeal. They sat near the kitchen doors, their hands tightly clasped together on top of the table. They looked confused, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the money being discussed and the viciousness of my family's attacks. They were simple, hardworking people who had never asked for a single thing in their entire lives. Marcus walked deliberately past Vivian, past Chantel, and past a completely defeated Bradley. He stopped right at the end of the table, standing respectfully before the Davises. He placed the heavy stack of legal documents gently onto the polished wood right in front of Arthur. Mr. and Mrs. Davis. Marcus announced clearly, his voice carrying the final, undeniable weight of the law. I am pleased to inform you that the asset transfers have been fully finalized and registered with the federal government. The irrevocable trust containing the $500 million payout from the Apex Medical acquisition is now officially active. You are the sole, undisputed, and permanent beneficiaries of the entire estate. Arthur stared at the documents, his weathered face blank with absolute shock. Mary let out a soft, involuntary gasp, raising her hand to cover her mouth, tears instantly welling up in her kind eyes. Vivian let out a strangled, horrifying shriek that sounded like an animal getting caught in a trap. Chantel slumped forward, resting her head in her hands as her entire world completely crumbled into dust. I looked at Arthur and Mary, flashing them a genuine, radiant smile. "It was the best investment you ever made, Arthur." Arthur looked down at the legal documents, his weathered hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the heavy watermarked pages. He stared at the 9-digit figure printed on the trust agreement, his lips parting in silent, overwhelming shock. Mary pressed her face into his shoulder, her shoulders heaving with quiet, disbelieving sobs. They did not care about the luxury or the status that kind of money brought. They only cared that their son's legacy was secure, that their grandchildren would never know the sting of poverty, and that the profound leap of faith they had taken for me had not been in vain. I kept my hand resting gently on Arthur's shoulder, offering a firm, reassuring squeeze. Suddenly, the sharp, violent sound of shattering porcelain ripped through the dining room. The movement was so fast, so utterly feral, that if you were watching the scene unfold on a screen, your perspective would have whipped violently to the other side of the table in a fraction of a second. The harsh afternoon light sliced through the tall dining room windows, casting a sharp, high-contrast shadow across Chantel's face. She looked completely deranged. Her perfectly contoured features, usually arranged in an expression of haughty superiority, were now twisted into an unrecognizable mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She had grabbed her antique dinner plate, still fully loaded with the catered salmon she had bragged about earlier, and hurled it across the room. The heavy plate exploded against the wall just inches from where Marcus was standing, showering the hardwood floor with sharp ceramic fragments, and leaving a dark, greasy stain sliding down my mother's expensive silk wallpaper. "You absolute piece of trash!" Chantel screamed, her voice tearing out of her throat with a shrill, hysterical pitch that made my mother flinch. "You are a disgusting, vindictive little parasite. You sit there and play the victim, pretending you are so righteous, and then you turn around and give half